Y'all want to know what I think is amazing? It's print. Man, print is such a fantastic technology. I mean, you put the words on the paper, and they stay there. You don't have to worry about keeping it updated all the time. So when you look back at the 500 or so years we've had of the printing press and the thousands of years that humanity has had putting ink on paper, you realize just how much of the communication techniques that we have to communicate hierarchy or structure or relationships or values, all of those are derived from the techniques and the processes that we've delivered to put ink on paper. And then we had to go and invent the web, which I'm going to say, on balance, I think has been totally worth it. But man, is it a pain in the ass. So the web just turned 20, 25. Opinions vary on how old the web is. But when you look back at the very foundations of the web, the very foundations of hypertext markup language, HTML, the Uniform Resource Locator, the URL, those technologies were created with the explicit intention that anyone, anywhere, could create a document that could be updated instantaneously and accessible globally. And I mean, when you just kind of take a step back from the day-to-day work that we do and really stop to appreciate just how different that is, just how much unlike print the web is, it's like 20 or 25 years isn't nearly enough time for humanity to have wrapped our heads around the ways that the web is different. And so as a result, for the last quarter century or so, we've been kind of band-aiding ourselves along by imagining that a web page is really just a glorified print document. I mean, it's square, it's like a sheet of paper, you can put stuff on it. But now with the rise of mobile devices, this is what has forced us to come to terms with the way that the web is different. And I want to be clear about this. The web has always been different. It's just that now, when I talk about content strategy for mobile, I'm the author of a book called Content Strategy for Mobile, I don't mean how do you get your website to work on smartphones. What I mean is that now, today, we have to give up this consensual hallucination that we've been operating under, that we have any control at all over the size of someone's screen, over the input mechanism they're using to interact, over how much bandwidth they have available. That's gone. And so that's already challenging for us to figure out with the rise of smartphones and now with tablets. But the bigger question is, for me, how do we as human beings wrap our head around a publishing process that we can no longer treat as if what we publish is locked inextricably to any one particular output format, to any one particular size sheet of paper or size screen? Now, I want to be clear. I am not a futurist. I am not here today to predict for you what I think will be the next big thing. But I will guarantee you one thing. There will be a next big thing. And whatever that next big thing is, we're going to have to figure out how to publish to it. Maybe the next big thing will be smart TV. So there's a lot of hypothesis that the next big wave of innovation will be around the living room. And so devices to create the web on your TV or an interactive TV experience will finally take hold. To me, the idea of publishing to smart televisions really drives home the fallacy of assuming we can make any assumptions at all around the size of the user's screen or what mechanism they are using to interact with it. And the idea that we will have to have publishing processes that will account for the smallest smartphone screens all the way up through the largest smart TVs should suggest that we can no longer rely on some of the outdated mental models that we've derived from print. Or maybe the next big thing will be in-car systems. Now, when I think about in-car systems, what I don't necessarily see is a touch screen on the dashboard of someone's car. Sure, maybe there's an interface there, there's a display that someone can use. But it's the interaction with what are likely to be hard-coded buttons on the steering wheel, and most important, an audio interface. Now, I think today, at this moment in time, it's really easy to mock audio interfaces, to yell at Siri and get mad at what she says and then throw your phone in the sea. You know what else was terrible, seen as a never going to work technology? Touch screens. Man, touch screens were terrible. You remember having to go to the ATM and having to figure out how to get your finger angled just right to get the button to push? For 25 years, touchscreens were seen as this also-ran technology, something that was never going to make the prime time. And then one day, touchscreens worked. And they worked perfectly. And it transformed our entire industry in the space of, 5 years? So I don't know when audio interfaces will finally become reality, whether it's 5 years or 15 years or 50 years, but I do know that one day the Star Trek computer is going to be real. And the last thing that I want when I go up and ask the Star Trek computer a question is for it to start spitting back http://open bracket at me. I will sometimes talk to developers who will say things like, Karen, why do we have to bother trying to parse out the difference between what should be rendered as emphasis and what should be rendered as italics when every single browser since the dawn of time has rendered emphasis as italics? Not in an audio interface, they don't. See, one of those things conveys visual styling. The other thing conveys meaning. In an audio interface, emphasis would be rendered as tone of voice. And so when you really start to peel this back, when you start unpacking all of the assumptions that we make, all of the baggage that visual styling carries, that is really intended to communicate meaning, and yet we have to find new models for communicating that if what we produce has a chance of working on another platform. If you're interested in this at all, I would check out with what Google is doing with what they call their conversation group. So Google, this is a company that can make cars that drive themselves. And that's not even their core business. That's just some side project somebody dreamed up. No, how human beings interact with technology through language, that is squarely in Google's sweet spot. And they are spending a huge chunk of their $11 bajillion trying to figure out how to make audio interfaces work. So if that's the case, maybe the next big thing will be Google Glass, right? I don't really think Google Glass is the next big thing. I think Google Glass is like the Segway of mobile. It's like a Segway, but for your face. But the idea that we will have to publish to a variety of different wearable heads-up displays, I think that's a reality we have to account for. I worked with a client recently that produces a giant catalog, like a huge phone book-sized catalog of industrial parts. And I talked to them and I said, look, I'm not here to tell you that you should stop printing this catalog or when you should stop printing this catalog. But I think we can all acknowledge that a day is going to come when the world will no longer need a giant catalog filled with washers and nuts and bolts and screws. So when that day comes, what happens if the most likely place where this company's customers want to interact with them is via sort of a wearable display? I think it's a potentiality. Their customers are people working in industrial settings. They're working on a factory floor. The idea that their customers might want to go in the back room and use a desktop computer simply isn't going to happen. And frankly, in those settings, they might not even want to pull a smartphone out of their pocket. They may already have some kind of wearable display that they're using to keep track of the equipment or monitor what's happening in the factory. And so for that company, the question they needed to ask themselves is, what do they have to do, starting right now, today, to change their publishing processes so that the products that they are creating, the catalog that they are producing, will be ready to be rendered on a display that doesn't even exist yet? So, Google Glass. That's not the next big thing. Obviously, the next big thing is watches, right? Right? Watches? Come on, we're all excited about watches. Sometimes I get to this point in the talk and people are like, oh, God, really? Watches? Karen, surely we don't have to worry about this. I mean, who's ever going to want to read a long document scrolling on their little watch screen? And that may be true, but that's what we used to say about smartphones. But even if we grant the argument that no one is going to use a watch as their primary content consumption device, the idea that a watch might sit as the hub of a larger ecosystem, that the watch could be the controller for your smart TV, or the watch could provide a way for you to navigate through things that you could then listen to in your audio interface. All of a sudden, then, the challenge of presenting content on a watch form factor seems a little bit more necessary. We need to find ways to make content presentable and understandable and navigable, even on the smallest form factors. But, I get it. Watches. So tiny. Surely not the next big thing. Maybe the next big thing is going to be stadium scoreboards. Come on, everybody. Let's get our content where everybody can see it. This is a joke. I put this in here and it's a joke. I thought it was funny because watches are so tiny and then scoreboards are so big. And then I turned around and I talked to a client that said that the biggest challenge they're trying to solve is digital signage. So this was a university client. And they had just bought all these new digital signs that they wanted to put up all over campus. And so they came to me and said, Karen, we have a responsive website, we have mobile apps, and now we have these digital signs. And we want a way that we can manage and maintain one set of content and have it automatically publish out to those 3 very different form factors. And so I thought to myself, and I said, hey, have you thought about treating those digital signs as if they're just a completely separate silo and managing those as if you had to publish to them separately? And they said, Karen, ain't nobody got time for that. No. Our goal is to take content like news for students or campus alerts or events listings, and we want to manage that in one place and have it show up, be rendered, have it work well on 3 vastly different form factors. This isn't some crazy futuristic dystopia that these people are living in. This is a real problem that real enterprise businesses are really trying to solve today. And so if that's the case, maybe you too will face a similar challenge in the future at home with your internet refrigerator. Right? Can't talk about the future without talking about the internet refrigerator. It's like, I think the biggest problem facing our society today is that I can't check Twitter in the 30 seconds that it takes me to get a Diet Coke. So I don't really think that the refrigerator is going to be the next big thing. But I do think the idea that our homes will also be a connected network of sensors and screens and devices. Heck, what if it's not an internet refrigerator? What if it's a digital cooktop on which the glass display, the glass cooktop of your range, could also have a touch screen embedded in it? And you could use that to navigate through videos or recipes or the news while you were cooking. Or, and I do think this is the biggest problem facing our society today, what happens when toaster printers become a reality? Is your website going to be ready to be burned onto delicious toast? These are the problems that we're here to solve today, together. Right now, today, the organizations that I work with are already facing the challenge of how do they publish to a vast array of different devices and platforms. They have a website, and now they're wrestling with the mobile web. Do they need to create apps? Do they have to create apps for different platforms and different screen sizes? And that's on top of the other channels they have to publish to. They have social media. They have campaign microsites. They have a series of blogs. They need to publish to their company intranet. They have email newsletters. Heck, some of the companies that I work with are still wrestling with how do they take the content that they produced for print and get it onto the internet. And yet tomorrow, there will be ever more new devices and platforms and screen sizes and resolutions and input models, and it's never going to stop. It is a veritable zombie apocalypse of new devices and platforms. How will humanity protect ourselves from this? The challenge that we face is in giving up our insistence on publishing to each and every platform as if what we create is uniquely intended for, uniquely styled and locked to that platform. I want to tell you, I don't care if you believe that any one of those new devices and platforms will be the next big thing. You can tell me, watches, never going to happen. Digital signage, not a problem for our business. It is the organizations that accept today that they must develop new publishing processes, that they must think of their content in new ways. Those are the organizations that will survive the zombie apocalypse. And what this means, what this really gets to, is something that I think drives a stake into the very heart of what makes the web the web. And it is this idea of having true separation of content from form, true separation of content from presentation. We have today too many different outputs, too many different screen sizes and formats and resolutions and input mechanisms for us to think that we can couple content with form in the same way that we did with print. Do you understand what a huge transition this is in how human beings think about publishing? For most of human history, it was impossible for us to create a document that could be separate from its presentation. Imagine going to this medieval monk who is laboriously hand-scribing documents and trying to have a conversation with him about the meaning and the structure of that document, separate from the particular instance of the document that he was creating, the particular layout and styling of that document. It wouldn't make any sense. Up until this point of history, there was no way that you could create a document that would be separate from the specific presentation you intended it for print. And yet now, that is the very challenge that we are trying to solve. Sometimes, I will go and talk to audiences like this, particularly a web development crowd, and I will ask them, what is the separation of content from form, content from presentation? What does that mean to you? And the developers in the audience will all say, ooh, I know this one. I know the answer. It's CSS. CSS is the answer. And that is true, to some extent. But yet, the challenge of separating content from presentation is something that goes much deeper than that. In fact, it is something that touches the work of every single person who is involved in creating the website. Dan Jacobson is the API guy from Netflix. He is formerly from NPR. He says that the future of content management systems is in their ability to capture the content in a clean, presentation-independent way. Now, when you read that, it's really tempting to reduce this to a problem with markup. Like, get your HTML out of my content. Ugh. And that is also a problem with the way that we think about content. I have developed a reputation on the web as being the president of the WYSIWYG Haters Club. WYSIWYG are these interfaces, these what you see is what you get interfaces, where we give content creators a toolbar at the top of the screen and we tell them, no, it will work just like this. This one even says, the word-like interface makes content creation easy for business users who know nothing about HTML and want to keep it that way. And so instead, we tell them, no, look, it's just like a sheet of paper. You have the familiar toolbar at the top of the screen. It works just like Microsoft Word. And you can go in and lay out and format your document any way you want. You can add a table. You can drop in custom bullet points. You can make a box and turn it purple and float it to the right. And that document, that web page, will look perfect in the one and only one platform that you were imagining when you created it, which was the desktop web. And then when it comes time to take that content to any other platform, to do anything else with that content, all of this is lost. Developers will sometimes look at this and they'll say, oh yeah, Karen, yeah, you gotta go in and you gotta strip out all that formatting before you can do anything else with it. Strip all that out? That was someone's whole job. Someone meant something by all of those decisions. But the problem was that we didn't give them any tools to communicate what they actually mean. When she created this document, she did not mean, I want a box that is purple and floated to the right. What she meant was, I want to create a table of contents. I want that to be set off from the body of the document. I want it to provide a signposting function that will guide the reader to what the container, what the contents of that document are. But we didn't give her any tools by which she could communicate what that actually meant. We only gave her tools to tell us what she wanted it to look like. So I've developed this reputation as really being one of the web's leading haters of WYSIWYG interfaces, and I don't mean to brag. I really do love coming to talk to groups like this. I think it's a lot of fun to do, but my graffiti crime spree is going exceptionally well. I was just in Germany. I really feel like I'm getting the message out to a much broader audience than I could previously. Do you know where WYSIWYG came from? It came from Xerox. It came from Xerox PARC. Because they invented the laser printer. Okay, think about this for a minute. Up until this point, a Xerox machine could only create a copy of a document that already existed. Xerox invented a way that you could print out whatever you wanted. But they needed a way for you to actually create that document. And so Xerox invented the entire concept of what you see is what you get editing. Xerox invented the entire concept of the graphical user interface so that they could sell laser printers. Now, I would argue that the laser printer is the most important component of the desktop publishing, the personal computing revolution. It was demand for laser printers. It was demand for people to print out newsletters that had too many fonts on the laser printer next to their desk. That is what drove adoption of the personal computer. That is what drove adoption of the early Apple computers. That is what led directly to the adoption of Windows computers. That is what led to the growth of the web. It is with a huge amount of respect for this metaphor, for this mental model that has enabled so many people to learn to use a computer, to get online, to start creating documents. It is a huge amount of credibility to this metaphor that has come before us that I feel I have to tell you now that the web is not a laser printer. I mean, for real. There is basically nothing that the web has in common with a laser printer. There is nothing about publishing to the web with its infinite updatability, with its global reach, that has anything to do with publishing to a laser printer. And yet, we are still trotting out the same tired mental model, the same old metaphors that we've been using for the past 40 years. Ted Nelson says that imitating paper on a computer screen is like tearing the wings off a 747 and using it as a bus on the highway. The web is so much better than print. And to unlock the value of the web, we have to stop thinking of web pages as if they are a sheet of paper. We are fighting a war. It is a war between blobs and chunks. Blobs are web pages. They're like WordPress fields or wiki documents or anything in which we treat a web page, in which the content and its layout, this container and the content are so inextricably tied together in one big messy glob of stuff that it is impossible for us to go back into it later and determine how to separate the content from presentation. Chunks are clean, well-structured, presentation-independent bits of content that have been created with the explicit intention from the start that they can and will live on a variety of different platforms in a variety of different contexts. We are fighting a war, people. We cannot let the blobs win. So this is your battle plan, Team Chunk. First thing we need to do, we need to create structured content. We need to create content where we haven't just laid it out as if it's a document, but rather we have described what it is. We describe what it is by creating semantic metadata. Metadata guides the layout and the format of documents so that information can be presented in different ways on different platforms, but yet retain the core concepts and the core meaning. We also need to create what I like to call content packages. So content packages are alternate forms of content, where we might think of creating variations so that content can work in other contexts. And if we're going to do all of these things, we need to create an author experience in our content management systems that will guide creators to do this well. Let's talk about each one of these in turn. To talk about structured content, I want to take you back to the halcyon days of the 1980s, when America had a favorite magazine. And that magazine was the TV Guide. Don't ever tell me that Americans don't read. TV Guide, most popular magazine in America. They could very reasonably have patted themselves on the back and said, "Good job, we are the best magazine out there." But they didn't do that. And that's because they realized that they were not in the magazine publishing business. They were in the content publishing business. And so way back in the late 1980s, long before the web even existed, TV Guide basically built their own proto-content management system. It was a green screen mainframe application that they built. And they told all of their content creators that now they were going to enter the program descriptions that they wrote for the magazine into this new application. Even more than that, they told all of their authors that in the future, they were no longer going to write only one program description. They were going to write 3. A short form, a medium form, and a long form. Now, if you've ever worked with writers, you might understand that their response was, predictably, why? Why am I doing that? Why? You just tripled my workload. Why am I doing this? They didn't know. They had no idea where that content might go in the future. They didn't know that one day you would have a cable box. And that cable box would allow you to browse through a TV Guide of listings and show you what might appear. They didn't know that one day TiVo would come along and revolutionize the television industry by providing essentially a giant VCR hooked up to your TV, and that you could browse through program descriptions and find what you wanted to watch. And they most certainly had no idea that one day you were gonna have a magical pocket robot, and it would talk to your television set. That you could pull out your phone and navigate to a program and tell your TV to go and record it for you. And yet, today, if you were to go to this TV Guide app and you were to look for a program that had aired in the 1980s, MASH or Cheers or something like that, the program description that would appear there is the exact same one that was written for the magazine 40 years ago. They are still getting value from that content today because they treated it as presentation-independent structured content. If they had treated that as if it lived only in the magazine, they never would be able to get it to appear on a phone screen today. The effort to go back in and remediate all of their old InDesign documents would have been too costly. And yet today, this still has value. And the reason it still has value is that that information was marked up with semantic metadata, as opposed to merely being styled for one particular output. I love these 2 quotes. Metadata is the new art direction, and metadata is a love note to the future. The first one suggests that we can no longer treat art direction and styling as if they are created for only one platform. We have to come up with new mental models for structuring information, for adding metadata to that information, so that we can describe what something means rather than just what it should look like. And the second, metadata is a love note to the future. This, to me, suggests the value that organizations get from thinking of their content in this way. If TV Guide had merely treated program descriptions as if they were styled, so to mark up a program listing and put the genre in bold and the name of the program in bold all caps doesn't mean anything. Knowing that that is the title of the program or the genre of the program or the description of the program means that in the future, that content can go other places. The Guardian ran into a similar problem when they launched these things called topic pages. So topic pages are essentially robot-generated pages. So they go into the database, and they pull back all of the articles that match a particular proper noun or a particular known term. When The Guardian first launched these pages, they had a big box right here called Top Story. But they ran into a problem, which was that in their content management system, they had no way of knowing whether one story was more important than another. So, for this solution, they came up with a strategy which was called make their editors do more work. So they told their editors, OK, every time one of these stories hits the CMS, you go in and you encode it 1 to 5. You go in and manually add some editorial priority metadata to tell us whether a story is a big deal or if it's just kind of a little deal. But here's the thing. They actually had a ton of editorial priority metadata about whether one story was more important than another. And it was all locked up in the layout of the print edition. You don't have to read a word on this screen to be able to know how important these stories are, not just in relation to the other stories on the page, but in relation to the other stories in the paper, and in relation to other stories over time. You pick up on cues like the style of the typography, the size of the typography, the number of column inches devoted to the story, the size of the picture, the placement of the picture, the use of color, the layout on the page. All of these are visual cues that we are so attuned to as human beings that you can pick up on them instantaneously. You don't even realize that you're doing it. This is somebody's whole job. Frankly, this is probably a couple of people's job at The Guardian, laying out the front page, laying out the paper. And yet, all of the work, all of the value of that guidance about how important stories were was lost when they took them out of this layout and they moved them into their digital CMS. So when it came time to do an iPad edition, they came up with a different strategy. They built an algorithm that reads the InDesign files for their print edition and derives editorial priority metadata based on some of the same cues that you would look at. So how many column inches, the type of typography, the placement on the page. And then they use that editorial priority metadata to drive the layout of the iPad edition. The iPad edition's not a replica. It's not a picture of the print edition. But the layout, the placement, the sizing of all of these stories is derived from the metadata that they glean from the print layouts. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that I think that the solution to people's problems is robots that read your print files. That's not my answer. But I love this example because it shows just how much of what we assume is something that is inextricably designed for a particular platform is actually something that conveys meaning. And if we're going to have a fighting shot of having our content render appropriately on all of these different new devices and platforms and screen sizes, we can no longer take valuable editorial work as if it is intended for one and only one platform. We can't get by with creating and recreating these structures, creating and recreating this metadata every time the content moves to a new platform. We have to have metadata that is attached to the content itself. Another challenge is that we need to create what I like to call content packages. So I led the redesign of the New York Times about 10 years ago. And as part of that redesign process, we came up with a package of different image crops. Now, when you look at this, when you look at an image like this, in one sense, these are all the same image. The crops of this image are intended to represent this story in every place or platform or screen size on which it might appear. So you could look at these and say, yes, all of these are the same image. Every single one of these could be used to illustrate this particular story. But they're not identical images. They are not these pixel-perfect, squished-down representations. The idea that we could create smaller or larger forms of images that serve essentially the same purpose or could be used to fill the same role in a document seems to make sense. People can wrap their heads around the idea of creating a package of image crops. Well, if that makes sense to you, then you should be able to wrap your head around the idea of also creating alternate sizes for text. One of my biggest pet peeves on the web is publishers that truncate their headlines. It's like, I want to sit the publishing industry down and say, do you understand your entire business model? Here, let me explain it to you. You present a headline of a story you want someone to read, and if they want to read it, then they tap or they click on it, and then you get ad revenue. That's basically it. And yet, you see publishers that simply can't find enough room on the screen to present the entire headline. NPR. So NPR, America's National Public Radio, is one of my go-to examples of how to do structured content right on the web. And yet, NPR truncates their headlines in their mobile app. The Guardian. The Guardian has an entire Tumblr devoted to celebrating the work of the tireless men and women who shorten headlines so they'll fit on your phone. And I complain about this a lot, and people, they'll say, well, Karen, it's not that big of a deal. But truncation prevents people from being able to understand what is actually shown. Truncation makes it difficult for people to navigate through information. Truncation makes it nearly impossible for you to find what you're looking for. If you've never been to the Smithsonian, or if you've never been to Washington, D.C., there's a heck of a lot of museums called the Smithsonian National Museum of something. You can't tell what this is. And truncation often obscures the meaning of what was intended to be communicated. Truncation is not a content strategy. Rather than assuming that we can create one form of content, often a form of content that was intended for the most generous-sized platform, we should be thinking, much like we would think with images, of creating alternate forms of that content. Shorter or longer version of headlines, shorter summaries that describe what the content is, so that the content will then have a chance of living on different platforms. If we're going to do all of these things, then, we need an author experience in our content management systems that will help guide people for how to create content the right way. I do a lot of work with content management systems, and so I get to see a lot of organizations' content management underpants, and a lot of these interfaces look like a database got drunk and vomited all over the screen. It is an endless series of checkboxes and radio buttons and form fields, and I'll ask people to walk me through the experience that they have in creating a piece of content. And it often goes a little bit like, okay, so you have to click this one box here, and then ignore all this other stuff. I don't know what it does. You shouldn't touch it. And then you need to go down here, and you need to choose this one thing. Don't forget this. Then you have to go back up, and you have to hit save. Don't forget to hit save, because if you forget to do that, everything is lost. And then you've got to navigate over to this completely different screen and find this other piece of information. It's a terrible user experience. And yet, when I talk about the value of structured content, when I talk about the value of semantic metadata, sometimes people will come up to me afterwards and they're like, Karen, that sounds great for you, but it's never going to fly in my organization. See, people, my team, they have a CMS where they hate all the fields. Like, they think the fields are terrible. They're begging for Microsoft Word. They're begging for something that has a WYSIWYG that they will understand, and they can just put stuff in it, and it's easy to format, and it makes sense to them. Now, there's a very famous, completely apocryphal, completely fake quote from noted American car manufacturer Henry Ford, who once did not say, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Henry Ford never said this. I'm going to quote it anyway. You know why? Because it's a great example of what we are doing right now in web publishing. Rather than trying to come up with better author experiences, better interfaces, better workflows for people who create and manage content, we are essentially building people a faster horse. We are essentially saying, sure, you can have a tool like Microsoft Word, but just use it to create web pages. Instead, we need to treat the author experience in our content management system as if it is every bit as important for our web publishing and business goals as everything else that we do. If you had an e-commerce website, you would know every single thing there was to know about that checkout flow. You would know every single place in the process where people would drop off, or they would make errors, or they couldn't figure something out. And you would go in and you would optimize that. You would go in and you'd try to research and you'd do A/B tests and you'd try to figure out how could you get that little bit of red to be smaller? How could you get people to finish this transaction flow? How could you prevent people from making mistakes where those mistakes prevented them from giving you money at the end of the process? So if you are in the business of creating content, and I assure you, everyone today is in the business of creating content, then your content management author experience is every bit as important to business value as this e-commerce checkout flow. And yet, I don't know anyone who treats their content management system with the same level of attention and care as they might treat an e-commerce process. I don't know anybody who does A/B tests or even looks at the analytics data or ever does usability tests on their content management system. And I think that it is time that we did better than that. I am a user experience person through and through, but I believe that beautiful software, even for back-end users, should be an expectation. And the reason that we need to do this isn't just because I want to provide a better user experience for people. It's because I believe that better content management systems foster better content. If we are to survive the zombie apocalypse, we need tools that will help people get there. I will leave you with this. We've said this for many years, but the rise of mobile devices is what really drives this home. The web is not print. The metaphors that we have used to manage web pages simply do not scale when we are dealing with a vast array of devices and platforms and screen sizes. And so it means that the way people create content has to change. We need new tools, new workflows, new mental models to help people create content that has a fighting shot of working across different platforms. Our future depends on fighting off the zombies. Our goal isn't to create web pages or brochures or documents. Our goal is to create content that can be seen and read and viewed and navigated on whatever device customers choose to navigate the web. You don't get to decide what device somebody uses to go on the internet. They get to decide that. It's our mission, it's our responsibility to provide a great experience for them, whatever device they happen to use. Thank you.